All right, let's get it started today. You guys will need a Bible. Grab a Bible if you don't have one. There's some back on the back stoop. And let's get started on our very last lesson for this year. By the way, thank you guys for coming tonight on summer break. I think we're officially on summer break for most of you. Everybody's on summer break, right? No? So you got another week? Tuesday? Okay, so tomorrow's last day. Well, anyhow. Is it a full day, Landry? Is it a full day tomorrow? Okay, so that's not too bad. That's not too bad. All right, so lesson 30, page 121. And so let's jump in here. I want to let you know, first of all, since you guys are here, one last quiz tonight. I'm going to give you a paper copy of it. Try to get that back to me this week, and we'll take a run at that as our last assignment. If you are missing anything, any assignments that I don't have, I will make that part of an email that I'll send home. It's not a grade card because we don't really take a grade in here, but just whether or not we've completed everything. And so that will be coming as well. So if you still owe me a quiz or something like that, that'll pop up in that, and that way I'll communicate that with through that email. Okay. All right. So number 30. So we have last week we talked all about Paul's epistles, and there'll be a fair amount of that on the quiz. And when I say quiz, it's obviously an open book quiz, so it's more of a worksheet, but it kind of defined a lot of the things about Paul's ministries, whether they were letters to churches, whether they were letters to young pastors, and then ultimately there were a few books that we looked at that were letters from other writers, Peter, John, James. What was the one book? Do you guys remember that we don't know who the writer was? You guys remember, Ada? Hebrews. And that's not a worry for us. I can tell you the fact that we don't know who wrote it isn't something critical, right? It's because what we believe in several of the books is they were, written by people, but from the words of someone else. That the Gospel of Luke was written by Luke, but probably dictated by Luke and written by somebody else, but by his authority. And so, again, we don't get hung up on it. What we do get hung up on is when something in a book, a letter or something is inconsistent with the rest of Scripture. Okay? So you guys, I don't know if you guys ever heard of the movie or the book for that matter, The Da Vinci Code? You guys maybe have seen it. Tom Hanks, movie star, started this movie called The Da Vinci Code, and it was all about a conspiracy of the Catholic Church back, almost 1,500 years ago, that claimed that the information about Jesus had been changed, that Jesus was actually married and to Mary Magdalene and had a baby and all this kind of stuff. And then they kind of changed the history, the Catholic Church did, in order to make Jesus seem more holy and more pious and so forth. So obviously that's untrue, but that's the gist of the book/movie. And so what they talk about in the movie is that several other letters or books or gospels were written that were removed from the Bible or not considered for the Bible. There's actually a couple gospels out there that are what we call, they're false gospels, but Gnostic gospels. One's the Gospel of Thomas. Another one is the Gospel of Judas. And so there are critics of the Bible that propose, why aren't these books included in the Bible? Now, there wasn't a time where a bunch of the church leaders, pastors, and so forth sat down and took all of these books and then just decided which ones would be in the Bible, right? The Bible, if you think about it, kind of works this way. The Bible assembled itself, not miraculously, but anything that had to do with Jesus that eyewitnesses could say, yes, that was true, ended up in the Bible. If, for instance, the Gospel of Judas, I know the professor right now that he runs the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., and he studied this gospel at some length. They found a couple copies of this Gospel of Judas. And in the Gospel of Judas, what we have, just fragments of it, is that Jesus and Judas were good friends, and they were in conspiracy together to try to overthrow the Roman government, and they faked his death and all of this other kind of conspiracy nonsense. The problem is when you take and you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels that we recognize in our Bible, and you put the Gospel of Judas, in a sense, in that same category, you see that the four Gospels that we know all agree. All that Jesus said, what he did, the miracles and things. And then there's this weird one, this anomaly that kind of stands out. Jesus doesn't refer to himself as the Son of God. There's not really much teaching about Jesus, talking about the coming end of the world in heaven and so forth and judgment. There's just this big conspiracy going on with him and Judas. So my point is that those things are removed from even considering being part of the Bible because they're so inconsistent, right? If let's say the last day of school. So for you guys that attend Trinity and so forth, you guys, if you were at the last day of school on Friday, okay, and so forth, and let's say, for instance, everybody shows up for school. You still, I assume, had to follow the dress code on Friday?
Spirit Day.
Oh, Spirit Day. Okay, so what was Spirit Day on Friday?
We got to wear jeans and a Trinity shirt.
Jeans and a Trinity t-shirt. Okay, so I would think that most people would do that because you break the trend of having to wear this. What if Will showed up in a monkey costume? Okay, right? And so somehow everybody in the class kind of goes, hey, we're all following Spirit Day tradition. We're wearing jeans and a Trinity shirt, and Will is wearing a monkey costume, right? Now, if we said, hey, you're all the same, you're all following the same spirit, code and so forth, you'd look at Will and go, Will kind of stands out. There was nothing about a monkey costume for any student, right? So we wouldn't say that you're all following it. There'd be something that would just jump out and go, that's inconsistent with everything else based on the definition of whatever Spirit Day was, okay? That's really what's happened with the Bible. When there is a gospel or a letter or somebody asks, why isn't this included? We really just measure it against the other books of the Bible. And if it doesn't line up, it's literally rejected by the Bible itself, not a group of people. Group of people don't get together and go, I don't want that book in the Bible because of some reason, right? So when we think about all of those, that's kind of the key of what I'm after here. So lesson 30 talks about obviously the last book of the Bible, Revelation, and really talks about the conclusion of Scripture. So in this class for crossover, we started way back in the fall, and we have walked our way all the way through all 66 books, at least in certain categories, all the way through, and the basic narrative, which is a story of Scripture, and kind of breaking it down. So we're going to do that again tonight briefly and just kind of review some of what we're doing. And then we'll talk a little bit about Revelation, and then I'll give you guys your quiz, and then we're done. All right? So when you think about the end of the world, let me just ask a couple questions about the end of the world. If you studied Revelation hard, really looked it over, right? Read it, studied it, researched it, and things like that, do you think it's possible for you to discover when the world will end? Okay, let me tell you why you won't. Because the Bible tells us no man knows when it will end. Okay, it doesn't say that it's really hard and you have to work really hard to figure it out. It just says no man will know. Okay, now tell me why, guys. Try to put yourself, this is always dangerous, put yourself in the mind of God. Why wouldn't God allow us to figure it out? If you knew when the end of the world was going to come, Shiloh?
We'll stop worshiping him and freak out.
Well, the point is, I think the point you're making is exactly right. We would make decisions based on that knowledge, right? If let's say, I'll pick on Ben because he's an 8th grade graduate now, right? And wise beyond his years. And so let's just assume for a second that Ben learned something from Revelation. Somehow it's available in there. And he figures out the world is going to end in 10 years. Okay? Now, do you think that changes anything for Ben and anybody he tells right now? World's going to end in 10 years, right? So you're going to be 25, 24 in 10 years, okay? So the point is, if you knew it was going to end in 10 years, then you'd worry about the end of the world when? maybe 9.5 years from now, right? Would you worry about it right now, 10 years away? You'd probably change a little bit of how you're living, right? You're like, I don't have to follow this. I don't have to necessarily obey. I'll just get right shortly before the end of the world, okay? Now, if you knew that the world was going to end soon, like next month, right? I may stop trying to tell other people about Jesus and just make sure I get my things right and my faith, my understanding, and so forth. Do you see how if you knew the end date, it would affect how you would live pretty dramatically? One way or the other, like Shiloh said, either I would freak out because you're like, oh, it's coming really soon, or I'd get really, really lax and complacent because I'm like, I have nothing to worry about. World's not going to end anytime soon, so I'll just eat, drink, and be merry, so to speak, right? So the idea of the end of the world being something that convicts us or interests us is very, very true. But that's the reason that God doesn't share that information with us. When I was growing up, when I was about your guys' age, I grew up in a big family, a lot of boys in our family, and my dad would often do this on Saturday. He would give us certain chores to do around the house, usually outdoor stuff, right? Clean the garage, split wood, whatever we were doing. We lived out in the country. And my dad would often say the same thing. I'm going to go run errands, right? And I'm going to go do some things in town. And I want this done by the time I get back. Okay? Now, what information did he not share with us? When he's going to get back. Okay? So, could you gamble and kind of go, I bet he's going to be gone for 3 hours. The garage cleanup is going to take me about a half an hour, so I can go play around for 2 hours and then just clean it up before he gets back. What if he gets back in an hour and a half? I'm in trouble, right? So the point is, so my mind would have been on, get the work done, right? Get busy doing the work because I don't know when he's going to come back, okay? That's really what Jesus says. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing and teaching them, and do that until I get back. Well, when are you going to get back? I'm not telling you. Right? So that I want you to be busy about this work and be of faith and be obedient and so forth. So that's part of the rationale, I believe, of why the end is not clear to us and why the search for when the end is a fruitless search. It's not worth looking for, right? For one, it's not in there. Now, we'll talk a little bit about Revelation briefly tonight. There's so much that goes on in Revelation that it's a fascinating study. But one thing you will not learn when you go through Revelation is when. You will learn about what's going to be true of the time, what things are going to take place. But it's not something that it's going to happen in the year 2000, such and such, or whatever. All right. So in that red box, brown box, that shaded box, the big picture. Shiloh, would you be willing to read that as usual?
After Paul's final missionary journey, the narrative of Scripture comes to a close. Tradition tells us that Paul went to Rome and was executed there for his faith, along with Peter. In fact, tradition tells us that all the disciples were killed for the faith except John, to whom God gives a vision at the end of his life. This is the book of Revelation. The disciples, however, do not give up their faith. Jesus himself told them that they would have to suffer even death for him to follow in his footsteps. They all knew that no matter what happened in their lives as they preached the gospel to the world, Jesus had a future for them both in heaven and in the new creation that Jesus is portraying. This too is our Christian hope. We've been called by the gospel, given faith through the Holy Spirit, and baptized into Christ. Because Jesus fulfilled all of God's promises for us, he is the main character of our stories. He died on the cross to forgive our sins, rose to promise us a new life, and is coming again to make all things new for his people.
Very good. Thank you. So flip the page. All right? And so we're going to set up the ending of the narrative of salvation. And so the end of the narration, or the end of the narrative, is Revelation. It's not Revelations, plural. Some people get that confused. Revelation is the last book of the New Testament, and it's the last book of the Bible. In it, we catch many glimpses of what has already happened in the past, and we get a picture of how the very end of the narrative of salvation will come to pass. But before we jump at the end, we need to take a good look at what has come before. This is the narrative of salvation and God's promises. So that timeline, even though there's not necessarily dates, there could be. Well, I guess there are kind of in the blue or the gray writing there. But it's a basic timeline, an overview of what we've done this year. So what we want to do tonight, just to kind of give a synopsis, an overview, a summary of the year, and also to give us a picture of Revelation, because it's important to not forget that. We're going to look through each of these verses, all right? And so in each of these verses, we're going to look at what the promise is and how God has kept it, okay? So take a Bible and let's open up first one, Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, first book of the Bible, 14 and 15. Now, when you guys look at this section, 14 and 15 of Genesis 3, what I want you to do is under it somewhere, I'm going to leave this up to you. I want you to write down the promise, and I'm going to help give it to you. We'll talk about it a little bit. But I want you to write it somewhere on this page of what that promise is, so that we have kind of a written record of this. Since these books are yours, guys, later on, I think we're going to end up probably using these in the future prior to, next year's of Revelation and so forth. Not reteaching this, but probably drawing from them in reference. So you'll want to hang on to them. So Genesis 3, 14 and 15. Will, would you read those two verses for me?
The Lord God said to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. You shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
All right. So here's the judgment of God upon the serpent and upon mankind as they have sinned. This is judgment here. So a couple things I want to say. This little side here. He curses the serpent, and what does he curse the serpent to do? When you guys are reading that, this is kind of interesting. What's going to happen to the serpent?
He has to slither on the ground.
So what does that seem to imply was the case before this?
Face tablets.
Maybe. We don't know for sure, but if the punishment is you're going to slither now, it seems believable that they didn't slither in the beginning, right? Now, I can't tell you what it is because this animal didn't actually exist, right? I mean, this was the devil in kind of, not disguise, but in a form that could interact with Adam and Eve, whether the animal was, created uniquely, whether he I don't want to say possessed it, but the point is what was unique about it. So part of the punishment for this animal or whatever is to slither on the ground. And obviously, as we see snakes today, they all slither. Now, I can tell you from a biology standpoint, I used to teach biology, there is nothing in the skeleton of a snake that implies a pelvis or a shoulder girdle. What they call is this framework, right? Your clavicle and your scapulas and the arms and so forth. If something were to have front legs and back legs, it would need a pelvis and it would need this and then obviously all the ribs. And when you look at the skeleton of a snake, it's basically a head and a backbone with ribs from front to back all the way along the line. So to think that somehow there is leftover of that or any sign of that is not true. However, the judgment seems to be along this line. So here's what we get really from verse 15. God says, I will put enmity. That means conflict. You will be opposed to one another between you, he's speaking to Satan, and the woman, right? So he's saying between you, Satan, and all of the fallen angels, I'm going to put enmity between you and humankind. Okay? And in pain, it says, in between your offspring, this is the key, right, to Satan and all of his, not that he has offspring, but those that go forth from him. Okay, so his demons and the legions that were kicked out of heaven. And he says between her offspring. So now he's talking about somewhere in her descendant line, there is going to be one that is opposed most dramatically to Satan. And it says he, there's singular, so he's talking about one ancestor of, or one descendant of Eve. He, that would be Jesus, shall bruise your head, which means Satan is going to be defeated, and you shall bruise his heel. One of those injuries is worse than the other, right? If you've ever bruised your heel, it's a minor injury. You bruise your head, actually the word is probably more accurate in Hebrew, crush your head, okay? Obviously one of those is worse. Jesus does defeat Satan once and for all, But he didn't kill him or destroy him. You can't kill something that's angelic, but he didn't destroy him once for all because obviously Satan is still at work around us. So here's the promise, right? Here's the promise. I'll put this under Genesis 3, somewhere below the timeline, above that arrow, whatever you want to do. The offspring of Eve will save us. That's the first promise, right? The offspring of Eve will save us. So that promise right there, guys, is what's going to continue throughout history. In fact, that's still our message, right? That there was an offspring of Adam and Eve one day that would save us. Now, we're probably looking at somewhere around 50 to 60 generations later, right? And I'm pulling that one kind of out of my memory banks here because I know there's a timeline in one of the Gospels that talks about how many generations between Adam and David and so forth. But anyhow, so that's the first promise. Jump up a little bit to Genesis 12. Go to Genesis 12. 1 through 3. Right? This is the call of Abram. And if you guys remember, Abram becomes who? Abraham. God changes his name. His wife Sarai becomes who? Sarah. Not a lot of change, but just a little bit. I could go into the reasons why, but it just aligns them with God a little bit more. Zach, would you read those 3 verses, 1, 2, and 3?
Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Well done, well done. So we talked about this, and this is a long time ago, that's why we're kind of reviewing it. God tells Abram, he says, I'm going to bless you, and here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to make of you a great nation. Now, if you remember, Abraham and Sarah don't have any kids till they're about what age? Yeah, about 100 years old. So this promise, for them, it seems like it's a little tentative. Right? I mean, Lord says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Nation seems to be about numbers, right? If you're going to make a great nation out of me, like, for example, Adam and Eve lived to roughly 900 plus years old. Now, if you could imagine that a woman could have a baby every year, year and a half, 2 years. That's pretty rapid, but nonetheless, you could imagine in 900 some years, that's a lot of kids. Okay? I mean, a lot of kids. Could you imagine having an older brother that's 500 years older than you? Right? I mean, that would be the case. Okay? So there easily could have been 500, 600, 700 offspring of Adam and Eve. We don't know how many they had, but nonetheless, that's what could have happened. Not to mention, their offspring could have started having their own offspring shortly thereafter, right? When you're, 18, 20, whatever, they would have started having kids. So while Adam and Eve are still having kids in their 900s, their kids, you're probably already in, 6 or 7 generations at that point. You'd have grandparents that are younger than you. That makes my brain hurt, Anyhow, so he tells Abraham, here's the promise. The whole world, jot this down, the whole world will be blessed by a descendant of Abraham. The whole world will be blessed by a descendant of Abraham. Jot that down next to over under Genesis 12, 1 through 3. That's about 2000 BC, all right? We talked about, so that's 2,000 years before Jesus even shows up on the scene. And that promise is true, right? When God told Abram, later Abraham, and said that I will make you a great nation, I will bless you and make your name great, you will be a blessing. Now, so far, that just sounds like God's going to bless him with kids, right? And obviously in biblical time, having children helped you, right? It helped take care of whatever your job was. You can imagine we don't have a very agricultural society as much anymore. There are still farmers, obviously, but not the majority of us. You can imagine if your husband and you are a husband and a wife, and you have kids, if you run a farm, it's going to be to your advantage to have lots of kids. That's more workers, right? If it's just you and your spouse running the farm, there's limits to that, right? Even with the machinery that we have today, the more kids you have, if you had 12 people working on your farm as opposed to 3, obviously kids are a blessing. Abraham knew that, and he said, so as God said, you're going to be a great blessing, make your name great, and so forth. But verse 3, I will bless those who bless you. So somehow God is setting an importance on the family of Abraham. Anybody who dishonors you, I'm going to curse. So it's really important how people treat you because of what God is doing. And then there's this last phrase, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, I don't know how many friends you all have, but your level of influence is finite, which means it has limits. I could drive to the next town and ask people that I meet if they know you. Most of them will say, I don't know who they are, which means your influence has limits, right? You follow me? For Abram, as God tells him, he says, everybody on the planet is going to be blessed because of your family. So what he's talking about is one of Abram's and Abraham's descendants is going to be the one that will bless the entire planet. And if you believe him, right, or believe in him, you'll be blessed. If you dishonor him, which means you reject him, you'll be cursed. So really what God is laying out here is really judgment. Heaven and hell. If you believe in Jesus of Nazareth, which is going to be a descendant of Abraham, okay, then you will be blessed. Blessed with heaven, life eternal, paradise. If you reject him, you'll be cursed. Cursed to an eternal death in hell, separated from God. Okay? So that promise is pretty blunt. I don't believe, if we look through scripture and so forth, that Abraham fully understood what that blessing was. If he did, he probably would have, just kind of going, well, here I am, my 90th birthday. We still don't have any kids, but I'm not worried. God said we'd be a great nation. Okay? The fact that he was panicked, right, and ultimately tried to have a child with, if you remember, Sarah gave him her servant girl named Hagar to have a baby. That's where they had Ishmael, and because they thought they had to short circuit God's plan, or that somehow God had forgotten about him. And so obviously God came and visited again and said, no, you are going to have a child. Trust me. And that's when they have Isaac, and you guys should know the story, where Abraham is then called to take Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him, and angel stops him and so forth. Okay, questions on those two? Anything? Okay, so we're setting up the story of what's important in Revelation, right? So we're not just reviewing for the sake of review. Deuteronomy, please. Deuteronomy. That's the 5th book of the Bible. Deuteronomy 18. We're going to look at 15 through 19. Right? Leah, I'm going to ask you to read this. Deuteronomy, deutero means two or second. Right? If you guys have ever studied in science, Ben, what are you going to go into? Do you know yet? No? So in high school, I would imagine if you go into biology, you're going to do some study of biology. I don't know if you guys do this in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. This might be a little advanced. There are certain kind of animals that are called deuterostomes. Deuterostomes, just like Deuteronomy. Stoma is opening. And so a deuterostome is an animal with 2 openings. If you guys imagine an earthworm, right? An earthworm has a mouth and an anus. Sorry, we had to use that word here in confirmation class, right? Food goes in one way, waste goes out the other end. Okay, it's basically a garden hose. Okay, so deutero means 2 or second. Okay, nomos in the Bible, Deuteronomy, nomos, right, means word or law. So Deuteronomy is the second time giving the law. All right, so it's giving the law a second time. So deutero, nomos, second time for the law. All right, Leah, 15 through 19, please.
they are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among my brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will fire him.
Very good. Okay, so just to be clear, guys, what was the job of a prophet? What was the job of a prophet? If Moses here is considered a prophet, what's the job of a prophet? Anna Joe?
To tell, to prepare the people for Christ's coming
By doing what? You're right.
by spreading his love.
Yeah. No. By spreading the news. You relay the message, right? The job of a prophet is to tell people what God tells you to tell them, right? If you have a sibling and your mom or dad say, go tell your sibling, your brother or sister, go tell them this, and you do that, you're kind of acting like a prophet, right? You're like, hey, mom says you got to turn off the TV. That's kind of a prophetic message. It's not really all that awe-inspiring when it comes down to it, but that's essentially what a prophet does. God spoke to Moses. Moses spoke to the people, okay? Now, here's why this is important. God tells Moses, he says, I am going to raise up another prophet like you. The thing is, he's going to be even greater than you, which means the message he has is even different than yours. Not different as in opposite, but as importance. Okay? So here's the promise over Deuteronomy 18. A new prophet like Moses will speak God's message. Jot that down. A new prophet like Moses will speak God's message. Okay? So let me just ask you, you don't have to write this down here. What was Jesus' message to the world? What was Jesus' message to the world? What was some of his message to the world? Bits and pieces of it. What would you think? Some of the things. Shiloh?
Make disciples of all nations.
Make disciples, right? Spread the word. What else? What else was Jesus' message to the world? What else would he have told the world? Think of the things that Jesus said. Things that he commanded. Come on, he's the center of our faith. What would Jesus have told people? He said lots of things. A lot of it was kind of around the same subject matter. And Joe?
Show people about what God's going to do.
Yeah, right? Talked about the promises. Did Jesus ever express any kind of love for people? Yeah, like all the time, right? I love you, okay? I'll die for you, and I want you to be with me. So that message was what Jesus did. That was not Moses' message. Moses was not passing on the message, I love you. I'll do whatever it takes for you. His message was, here's what God said. You better do it or else. Right? That's the message they needed at the time. Right? Now, you guys know, I want you to think back if, well, you probably have witnessed this. Some of you guys that are in school, well, all of you were in school, with elementary school. You know how you teach little tiny children? Like kindergartners, first graders, things like that. You teach them differently than your teachers teach you. They can relate to you in a way that they can reason. They can explain things differently. Sometimes with little kids, you just say, stop doing that. Don't run. Sit down. Okay? Now, I get when you get carried away, maybe your teachers talk to you like that, but most of the time they can reason with you because you have a different understanding, a different maturity. And obviously, for the young people of God, the young Hebrews, children of Israel, they needed just rules. Don't have any other gods. Don't misuse my name. Honor those in authority. Don't kill. Don't steal. All those things. All right. 2 Samuel. Keep going. 2 Samuel. We're obviously going forward in the Bible. It's chronological. 2 Samuel 7, 12. Landry, this is going to be you. So here we are in 2 Samuel. If you look on the timeline in your workbook, who are we going to be talking about here? Who's the character? David. right? So probably the greatest king in Israel's history. This Sunday, you guys hear in the sermon, I'm going to be talking about the second greatest king in Israel's history. It's not Saul. But on the Sunday sermon, you guys will hear it. I won't tell you now so that, you'll be anticipating it. Landry, 12 through 16. Very good. All right, so he is talking about one of David's ancestors is going to sit on the throne forever. Jot that down as a promise. One of David's descendants will sit on the throne forever. Now, that obviously is talking about something outside the purview of human history, right? David knew he was going to start ruling and then he was going to end ruling. Every king starts and finishes. But this promise is that a descendant of David will sit on the throne forever. And it talks about a couple of things. The Father will love him and never not love him. However, he will be punished with the rod of men and the stripes of the sons of men. Interesting, he's probably talking there about the scourging that Jesus will undergo, which wouldn't have been the case here. He's going to build a house for my name, right? Talking about the church, but not a building like we're in. The body of believers, the church, right? And so there's that promise again. So every one of these promises, if you guys look back here on page 122, we have 4 promises so far. Every one of those was fulfilled or is still being fulfilled by Jesus, right? So Jesus was the promise all the way back from the Garden of Eden once sin entered in, right? The descendant of Abraham, that the whole world is, we believe, because of Judgment Day, is going to be either blessed or cursed, right? A prophet that is greater than Moses proclaimed the message of God. Jesus' message was, I love you, I want you, here's how you get to heaven. And the descendant of David obviously will sit on the throne forever. All right, Daniel 7, go there please. Daniel 7, you got to go a ways into the Old Testament at this point. Daniel 7, 13 and 14, Anna Joe.
I saw in the night, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like the Son of Man. He came to the Ancient of Days. He was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, and glory of the kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. His kingdom one that shall not be destroyed.
Good. So this is somewhat, I'll say cryptic. What I mean by that is it's somewhat mysterious as far as what this meaning is. Daniel, and that's what we're reading from here, he's a prophet, but he's got a special name. He is one of just a handful. Ezekiel and Revelation and so forth are what we call apocalyptic prophecies. You guys know what apocalyptic means?
End of the world.
End of the world. Very good. So he is talking about Christ's return. And what's interesting about Daniel, what hasn't happened yet since this is the Old Testament? He's talking about Christ's return.
And Jesus hasn't even come yet.
He hasn't even come yet the first time. He's talking about his second time. Now, he doesn't understand whatever God has given Daniel as a vision. He doesn't understand Jesus as a name or where he's from in Nazareth. That wouldn't have been relevant. But he does say in his vision, he says, a man like the Son of Man, glorious, unique, majestic, and so forth. So here's the promise, and I'm getting this a lot from verse 14. The Messiah, right? That would have been the Hebrew word for the anointed one. This is the promise. The Messiah will be the ruler of all things. So jot that down. the Messiah will be the ruler of all things, and all the world will worship him. All the world will worship him. So the Messiah will be the ruler of all things, and all the world will worship him. Everybody got that? So this is really prophesying about Judgment Day and what comes next, right? We're going to see in Revelation, not that we're going to read it tonight per se, but it says that all the nations and tribes of the earth gather around the throne to sing, holy, 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 right? And that worship that's going to take place because of Jesus. All right, let's go to the New Testament, because it is not irrelevant. It's just the next part of the story for us. John chapter 1, and we're going to look through 1 through 5. Shiloh, I'm going to have you read this for us. In fact, let's split it up this way, since we're actually going to come out just perfect. Shiloh, I'm going to have you read 1 through 5. Ada, I'm going to have you read 9 through 14. Okay, go ahead.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
All right, so the first promise here is simply this: Jesus is God. All right, that's the first part of the promise. So leave yourself a little space. What I love about the way that John begins is he starts out, it sounds kind of, again, cryptic, mysterious. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then right away, it comes to a pronoun. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, without him. So obviously the Word is talking about a person, a he. And obviously as you start to piece this together, you're like, oh, it's Jesus. All right? It just happens to be the way that John kind of poetically begins it. Ada, 9 through 14.
The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Perfect. So the second part of the promise, let's just put it this way: his light saves us. His light saves us. So Jesus is God. His light saves us. I could go into a whole lot more detail of why the light, what that it's important, but that's essentially where it is. His light saves us. So there we are. It's pointing to Jesus. AD 1, Jesus' ministry begins. For roughly 3.5 years, Jesus' ministry kind of is conducted. And then we have the early church. And so we're going to have Ben, why don't you read for us Galatians chapter 4, 4 through 7, as Paul writes this one to the church in Galatia.
But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir to God.
Perfect. Well done. So here's the promise. He is the promised Redeemer, right? He is the promised Redeemer. We are heirs, right? He is the promised Redeemer. We are heirs. H-E-I-R-S. We are heirs. Which means as an heir, as Ben read, an heir receives from his master what is his. And so if Jesus' role is to be an occupant of heaven as heirs, we receive that from him. It's a gift. Okay? All right, so I want you to look at both those pages. I want you to look at those 7 promises. I don't want you to don't get distracted by the fact that there's 7. It's a good number in the Bible. But that is just an overview of really what you have done in this class up until now, right? But what you see is all the way through this narrative, who's the main character? It's always Jesus, right? So the promises of Jesus from Genesis through Abraham, through Moses, through David, through the prophets like Daniel, all the way to the Gospels where Jesus is introduced physically, through the early church of Paul and the writers in the New Testament and so forth. That same message is all the way through. So now we are ready to just touch on Revelation. All right? So in that red box or brown box at the top of 123, let me just read this. Revelation is unique in the New Testament as it is, underline this, the only book of pure prophecy. It is the only book of pure prophecy. Now, it looks a lot like Ezekiel or Daniel. I mentioned that. Those are both apocalyptic of the Old Testament. And it's the last book of the Bible. Now, when I say it's the only pure book of prophecy, it doesn't really have a story to it. There's very little narration other than John was given a vision. An angel spoke to him and said, write this down. Quite literally what it says. That's the only storyline. And then John starts writing down what he sees. In, like, for instance, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they won't bow down and worship the golden image that the king Nebuchadnezzar sets up, and so they're going to get thrown into the fiery furnace, or at least Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and all of these things. But that's still a story in the midst of the prophecies. Revelation is really just almost complete prophecy from beginning to end. Right? By this time, Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans. The other disciples had been killed for their faith. John was a very old man, likely living out his last days. So at this point, historically, John is the last of the 12 disciples that are remaining. Everyone else has been martyred. Now, you guys know what martyrs are, right? Killed for their faith. And so John has been exiled to the island of Crete, or I think that's right. And so we see this beginning of the last message that God has for us through, if you remember, one of his closest disciples being John. What special duty did he give John? Do you remember? Jesus gave John a special responsibility. Looking after his mother. It's interesting that this is one of those times, I believe, that Jesus was exercising his godness, right? His ability to know. All the other disciples are dead and would have died for their faith. And John is the one who lives the longest. So who does he put in charge of his mom? The guy that'll live the longest, right? So if John is an old man at this point, Mary has probably passed away, so she was taken care of for her whole life. That's just Jesus being a good son, right? So Revelation 1, 9 through 19. Let's have everybody read 2 verses for me, and I know we'll finish before we get there. So, Will, I'm going to start with you. So Revelation 1, 9 through 19. Everybody read 2 verses, and we'll just move my way around here clockwise. So, Will, give me 2 verses.
I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and kingdom, and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and testimony of God. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet.
Keep going, Zach.
Saying, write what you see in the book and send it to the 7 churches of Ephesus and to
Smyrna
and to Pergamum.
Good.
And to Thyatira.
Good job.
To Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea.
Man, good job. That's really good. Yeah. Give me one more.
Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands.
Very good. Keep going, Leah.
In the midst of the lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and his feet were like the snow of the sea. His feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of the sea. And his feet were like the snow of
Keep going, Landry.
His feet are like burnished bronze refined, and his voice is like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the shining sun of full.
When I saw him, I fell at his feet, though dead. But he waved his right hand up and said, "Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death."
Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this.
All right, very good. Now, there's a lot we could cover in that, but here's the basics I want you to understand. If you guys were to witness something that you have never seen before, okay, this is really where John is, right? He is getting a glimpse of the throne room of God, gifted by God, and he's trying to express what it looks like, right? So if you look through those verses, we don't have to count them, but if you see how many times he uses the word like, right? He's saying his hair was like, his eyes were like, his robe was like, right? His feet were like. He's trying to draw a comparison, okay? If you come in, I was talking to one of our seniors here at church, and she runs in the track team, and they had a big competition for districts, I think, this last weekend. And she'd been out in the sun, and she's all red in her face. And I told her, I said, your face is like beet red. Okay? Does that mean that her face looks like a beet? That wouldn't be very nice to say. You look like a vegetable, right? No, we're just making a comparison. If you get sunburned and you're like, you look like a lobster, I'm not expecting you to crawl around on 10 legs and have big pinchers, okay? Instead, we're trying to make some comparison, even though seeing someone sunburned is something we're familiar with. John was unfamiliar to what to say about looking at God, right? Jesus specifically. And he says his hair, his eyes, and so forth. And then he even makes this, out of his right hand were 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, right? What that is, it's probably symbolic for important words, right? Words that are powerful and cut, which means they make an impact. So we see this. Now, in summary, right, here's what I think. According to Jesus, what is the purpose of this vision? Jot this down under that first paragraph there. Jesus is coming back to make all things new for his people waiting. I'll give you that again. Jesus is coming back to make all things new for his people waiting. That is the message of Revelation. Revelation people often get kind of concerned or scared of. Let me give that to you one more time since you guys are still writing. Jesus is coming back to make all things new for his people waiting. Most people think that Revelation is scary. The first couple of chapters, it does talk about God's judgment. And there will be destruction of those that reject God. Right? That's coming. That's a given. We want to do everything we can so that people will not be destroyed and not suffer because of that. But it comes down to those that trust in Jesus. Revelation for a Christian actually is filled with good news. Right? It's a harsh reality, okay, of judgment and the end of the world and remaking a new one the way it was meant to be. But nonetheless, that's the basics of what we see. Now, in your Bible, here's what I'd like you to do. Would you just scan through Revelation chapters 4 through 20? Just scan through it. Look at headings. Look at paragraph starts and things like that. And I want you just to, as you read through, just all you're doing is summarizing, not reading the paragraphs, just the headings. And then tell me what you tend to see a lot of. Going through chapters 4 through 20. Tell me what you start to see. Start at 4. And tell me what kind of things you see as far as the headings. Anybody want to share something you're coming across?
A lot of 7s.
A lot of 7s, okay? So there's a code, right? Anna Joe?
Bowls, trumpets, and angels.
All right, so there's some symbolism in here too. So you see a lot of symbols that John is able to see, and those symbols mean something. In fact, to John, who's a good I'll say a good practicing Jew, he'd been a Jew his whole life, these things would mean something because they have a lot to do with the temple and worship, right? And so you see these. So you got trumpets. Then you got some symbolism in Revelation 12, the woman and the dragon. There's talk of a dragon. The woman is a bad woman, and that's mostly because of it's a reference to Israel that has rejected God, and she is a characterization of that. There's talk of beasts, first beast, second beast, the number 666. Then there's Jesus, the Lamb, and what's going to happen on the earth. Then if you look at Revelation 15, there's the 7 angels with the 7 plagues that are going to judge the world, and the different bowls and things like that. And then we have the beast, the enemy of the world, the fall of Babylon, which is cryptic again for the evils of the world. So throughout that, what you really see, let me just read this paragraph down, third paragraph in that red line. I want you to underline this for me. It says, people read a lot into this, but Lutheran Bible scholars agree on this. Underline this, starting here. Revelation 4 through 20 shows 3 visions of the same thing in different ways. I want you to underline that. Revelation 4 through 20 shows 3 visions of the same thing in different ways. Right? So, and the reason I want to give that to you is so, in some ways, Revelation won't be so intimidating. That you understand that there's 3 different visions essentially being laid out for John. And each time, right, a voice tells John, write this down. And that's why we kind of get that determination that there's something important to look at and to see. Guys, that's as far as I am going to go tonight. That is it. And so that's it for tonight. That is it for crossover. I am going to give you guys your quiz before you go. And so before you leave, come up and get that, and then that